On the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, President Obama addressed a packed auditorium at Xavier University in New Orleans and acknowledged that the storm's devastation was as much a result of a man-made catastrophe as it was a natural disaster. The truth is, the president admitted, there are some wounds that have not yet healed, and there are some losses that can't be repaid. And for many who lived through those harrowing days 5 years ago, they're searing memories that time may not erase. Obama's statement was a powerful and rare recognition that the democratic promise of human equality and justice for all remained unfulfilled. Yet almost immediately, before there was time for the weight of those words to sink in, before there was even time to ponder how we might create or perfect a democracy that eradicates Hurricane Katrina's, that does away with the racial, regional, class, and gender inequalities that Hurricane Katrina exposed, the president turned to an idea of New Orleans that those of us who are from the city or who have visited are all familiar with. He said, but even amid so much tragedy, we saw stirrings of a brighter day, and we saw music and Mardi Gras and the vibrancy, the fun of this town undiminished. Obama's evocation of New Orleans as a place of fun and frivolity, of escape, of good times, draws on a much longer history, one that has always juxtaposed the New Orleans of disaster, whether that be natural disaster, environmental, political, economic, or racial, with the New Orleans of desire, sensual, exotic, carefree, decadent, taboo. The tension between these two New Orleans, the New Orleans of disaster and the New Orleans of desire, has been magnified in the wake of Katrina. Not just in the way that President Obama, or President Bush for that matter, have talked about the city in tourism terms, but in the way we think about rebuilding the city, rebuilding people's lives, and rebuilding the idea of a democratic society in which all are accounted for. Despite the reality that for many of us, Katrina fatigue has set in, when people are no longer aware or no longer interested, that New Orleans post-Katrina recovery is uneven and incomplete, there are ways that we continue to grapple with New Orleans' contradictory identity and to puzzle over the problem of disaster and democracy in the wake of Katrina. As is often the case, perhaps the richest forum for these reflections has been within popular culture, most notably the city's tourism narrative. Today, I'd like to consider a few of these examples: post-Katrina disaster tours, BP Oil's public relations campaign following the oil spill, and the HBO series Treme illuminate the complicated relationship between disaster and democracy. Hurricane Katrina bus tours that erupted following the storm were immediately controversial. The buses transported visitors to the hardest hit areas of the city, particularly predominantly African-American neighborhoods such as Gentilly, where public housing had been razed, or the Lower Ninth Ward, where the landscape remained scarred by overgrown neighborhoods, dilapidated houses, and impassable roads. And yet, for all their potential exploitation and profiting from people's suffering, the tours also remapped tourist New Orleans and forced visitors to physically and psychically confront both the presence and absence of African Americans in the city by including African American neighborhoods and histories, and by making visitors contend with the racial and economic disparities that shaped the storm's impact and continues to shape the recovery. At their best, these tours reoriented tourists from a mindset of leisure and entertainment to one of political engagement and activism, which was evident when local white tour guides went off script and recast Katrina victims, or worse, opportunists, as Katrina survivors and national citizens who were unjustly and inhumanely treated by powerful government interests. One guide criticized political and business elites who exploited poor and marginalized communities. He surmised, quote, "The top-level people provide jobs and housing. They came back, but the entry-level people couldn't come back. They had no place to live. They brought in 70,000 Hispanics from Honduras and Mexico to clean up the city. They paid them $17.50 an hour in cash every day, no income tax, as an incentive to do a dirty, stinking, dangerous job," end quote. When driving through the lower Ninth Ward, tour guides dispelled stereotypes about African-American vagrancy and delinquency. One guide painted a portrait of industriousness and community pride to elicit a compassionate response from tourists. It wasn't that the people in this area were just sitting back getting a welfare check, she asserted. They were working, making just enough money that kept them off the welfare road, but they were working and they were proud of their little homes. The majority of the people were working people. They worked in the hospitality industry. They worked in the culinary industry. They were waiters. They were cleaners. They worked for the hotels, the restaurants, the convention center. These narratives substantiated one tour guide's indictment, "We were done in by an act of man," or another's accusation that the government let a lot of people down. Tour guides' criticisms typified the post-Katrina narrative, shifting of blame from the victims of the storm to the government authorities and private corporations who had violated the public trust. A recurring theme was that Katrina hit all classes and races of New Orleans, and that the dismal recovery efforts did not reflect the character of the people, or more specifically, the deviance of Black people, but the failures of political and business authorities. In these instances, tours deviated from the narrative of desire and embraced a narrative of democracy that embraced social equality in practice and in spirit. Yet the bus tour's more democratic vision was immediately undermined once the Katrina portion of the tour was completed and passengers were diverted uptown to the palatial mansions of the Gardic district, where, as one guide promised visitors, quote, "You will get a sense of the luxury and extravagance of New Orleans. This is a true step back into the antebellum era." This step back into the sanctity of the antebellum white city from the trauma of the abandoned Black city signified a retreat from the difficulty of redressing racial and class inequality into the security of a white mythical past, replacing the post-Katrina vision of democracy with the tourist-sanctioned fantasy of a slaveocracy. We see this fantasy throughout New Orleans in storefronts and tourist shops, where the iconography of slavery glamorizes this history and caricatures Black contributions to society. Yet New Orleans relies on this problematic tourism narrative to propel post-Katrina recovery. The constant fear that tourism, and hence the city, will not rebound if tourists are not entertained and reassured by these familiar tourist conventions prompted tour guides to thank tourists profusely for taking the tour, visiting the city, and helping to support the economy. Their assurances, every penny spent helps recovery, and tourists could not do more than they're doing just being here, had as much to do with their own livelihood as service industry workers as the ongoing challenges facing New Orleans. The inclination to resuscitate the hospitality industry and the tens of thousands of jobs associated with it reestablishes business as usual and relieves visitors of any political, social, or moral responsibility beyond being tourists. In fact, some scholars have shown that efforts to promote tourism in New Orleans have often aggravated inequalities and superseded efforts to rebuild and revitalize communities. Undoubtedly, the reliance on disaster tourism has mitigated against challenges to the status quo or the pursuit of a more egalitarian, democratic society. BP Oil's national public relations campaign following the oil spill also highlights the tension between democratic ideals and post-Katrina recovery. BP initiated the campaign following former CEO Tony Hayward's highly publicized gaffe that you may recall, most notably his complaint that he would like to have his life back. Newspaper and television ads reiterated the campaign slogan, "We will make this right," which slyly capitalized on the name recognition and political activist cachet of Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation, committed to rebuilding the lower Ninth Ward with sustainable, affordable housing. At a cost of over $93 million in its first 4 months, the BP ad campaign attempted to alter the company's image of corporate greed and put forward a face of social responsibility, caring, and community engagement. In a move that typifies New Orleans' racial paradox of desire and disaster, BP made the face of this campaign and the face of the company 2 African-American executives, both from New Orleans. In several television and print ads, Iris Cross and Darrell Willis each earnestly faced the camera and told a national audience that they would be in the Gulf for as long as it takes to get it right. At the same time that the NAACP was investigating the impact of the oil spill on the region's most vulnerable communities who suffered financial woes, a loss of livelihood, increased physical and mental health problems, concerns over seafood safety, and intensified pressure on families and community networks, BP Oil was reassuring the American people that the region would recover completely and all of those impacted by the spill would be made whole. Through its African-American surrogates, who symbolized the company's race and class neutrality, even as they implicitly invoked and responded to the company's exploitation of the region's most marginalized communities, BP deflected a resurgent environmental activism. Yet it was through its investments to Louisiana tourism industry that BP most effectively shored up the state's historic dependence on the oil and gas industry and largely silenced local criticism. New Orleans was granted the largest share, $6 million of the $30 million that BP committed to restore Louisiana's tourism industry. The city's Convention and Visitors Bureau used the money to initiate a marketing campaign reminiscent of its post-Katrina efforts that compelled potential visitors to replace images or memories of human suffering, social injustice, and environmental disaster with tourist images of festive, carefree, and apolitical scenes unaffected by racial, environmental, or social problems. New Orleans CVB President Steve Perry emphasized the dual message of the campaign to tourism promoters when he told them, "You've got to be deeply honest about this, saying this breaks our hearts. It's really a gut-wrenching, horrible catastrophe. That's the same distance away from us that Philadelphia is from New York." Perry's message was evidently successful. Due in large part to BP's contributions, New Orleans reached a tourism milestone in 2010 by attracting more than 8 million visitors, the first time since Hurricane Katrina. 2011 numbers were even stronger, and 2012 is projected to show a further increase in visitors and tourism spending. With increased sales tax revenues and hotel occupancy rates, the city is experiencing an economic boom and an international revival as a top tourist destination. And yet, outside the tourist zones, many neighborhoods continue to languish because of a dearth of affordable housing, a controversial corporatized charter school system, a corrupt and ineffective police department, and inadequate access to health care. New Orleanians have found creative ways, as we often do, to register their dissatisfaction with government policies and priorities and to demand that their voices are heard in the rebuilding process. Yet David Simon's critically acclaimed HBO series Treme, though a fictional depiction of post-Katrina New Orleans, may offer the most powerful critique of a tourism-dominated recovery and its neglect of the nation's democratic vision. In this scene that I'm about to show, taken from episode 3 of season 1, set against the backdrop of the ravaged lower Ninth Ward neighborhood 3 months after Katrina, Mardi Gras Indian Chief Albert Lambreau, played by Clark Peters, pays homage to Wildman Jesse, a fellow Indian whose corpse was discovered outside his home months after the flood. Lambreau leads the group with a moving rendition of Indian Red, the traditional Black Indian anthem that opens each rehearsal and identifies each member's position in the tribe.
How you doing, sir? What's this about?
You tell me what this here's about.
Well, people want to see what happened. Hey, is that your house?
Drive away from here, sir.
No, we was just coming around to...
Just drive away.
I'm sorry. You're right, I'm sorry.
As viewers, we are rightfully outraged and even ashamed at our own complicity on intruding on the most sacred, painful, and private aspects of people's lives. Yet our viewership also attests to the bus driver's contention that people want to see what happened. In this way, the scene illustrates the tension between the welcome recognition and celebration of New Orleans Black expressive culture and its spectacularization and commodification. While the tour guide apologizes and departs with the tourists, we as viewers remain gazing on the disrupted memorial and the deserted neighborhood. Co-creator David Simon has said that the series, quote, should not be a tourism slideshow. If we do it right, it will be about why New Orleans matters, end quote. And yet Treme takes up where the disaster tour leaves off, giving viewers, televisual tourists, access to people, places, events, and experiences that exist beyond the tourist landscape. But I would argue instead that we must do more than see what happened, or see Treme, or the lower Ninth Ward, or the Gulf region affected by the BP oil spill. There is much that we can do to ensure that we protect one another from the type of man-made catastrophes that Katrina exposed, and to advocate for one another as we try to recover and rebuild New Orleans and the rest of the nation. After all, the issues animating post-Katrina New Orleans are ones that affect communities throughout the country. Inadequate affordable housing, segregated and underperforming schools, the exploitation of undocumented workers, corporate polluters that put profits over people, and the widening gap between the haves and have-nots are the types of national disasters that require our ongoing commitment to the democratic principles of transparency, inclusion, equality, and justice. Thank you.